Hi there, thanks for joining me today. In this video I want to talk about PNP Ontario, specifically employer criteria. If you have an employer in Canada that's willing to offer you a job, you might be eligible under the Provincial Nomination Program in Ontario. There are some criteria that the employer has to meet, so let's go through that, and if your employer meets this criteria, then potentially you might be eligible under the PNP Ontario category. So for starters, the employer must have been an active business, or the business has to continue to be active, and in either a corporation, limited partnership, or sole proprietorship for at least 3 years. So you have to ask your employer if they have been in business for at least 3 years. So that's criteria number one. The second one is obviously common sense. It's the business has to be in Ontario, obviously. The other criteria is we have to focus if your employer is inside the GTA, the Greater Toronto Area, or outside the GTA. So if the employer is inside the Greater Toronto Area, then they would have to show a minimum of 1 million in gross annual revenue for the most recent fiscal year. So that's very important because it differs if your employer is outside the GTA. And we'll talk about that in a minute. In addition, if your employer is located inside the GTA, the other requirement is that the employer has to prove that there are 5 full-time permanent residents or Canadian citizens working at the same location that the foreign worker will be working at. So they have to be 5 full-time permanent residents or Canadian citizens working for the employer. Now let's assume your employer is outside of the Greater Toronto Area, so outside the GTA. At that point, the employer only has to prove a minimum of 500,000 in gross annual revenue for the most recent fiscal year. So that's pretty much half of what it is if you're inside the GTA. And in addition, instead of 5 full-time employees, you only have to prove that there's 3 full-time employees that are Canadian citizens or permanent residents that are working in the same location that the foreign worker will be working. So that's a very important distinction. And if you have an employer that meets this criteria, as stated, you could potentially qualify under the PNP Ontario. Now the good thing about this is all your employer has to do is offer you a job and demonstrate that they've done recruitment efforts to hire Canadians. You don't necessarily have to have a positive labor market impact assessment to process this application. So all we have to do essentially is post the position on Job Bank Canada and some other websites and show to Canada that the employer has done ample recruitment efforts to hire a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident, but they were unable to do so, and for that reason the foreign worker is needed. So there are also some criteria that the employee has to meet. For starters, it has to be a full-time position and a permanent position, which means there cannot be an end date. Second, the requirement is that there has to be a minimum of 30 hours per week, or in total 1,560 hours per year. Obviously, the foreign worker has to be eligible for the occupation, which means we do have to prove that whatever position the employer needs the employee, they can do that. So if it's a NOC A, B, or O, they have the skill sets that the employer is looking for. This is not for any low-skilled positions. That's called the in-demand skill stream specific occupations in agricultural and construction sector, which will accept NOC Cs and Ds, which will be a subsequent video. So for this video, we're just focusing on employers giving job offers under NOC A, B, or O. And of course, the minimum wage has to be met. So whatever the minimum wage is, or the prevailing wage, I should say, for that occupation, the employer should be willing to pay that. So those are really the requirements for the employer and employee. If you are an employer or an employee that qualifies under this category and you would like to discuss this further, do give us a call today. We're here to help. Thank you, and until next time.